This video is being made in response to many requests that I make one about the Tavistock Institute of Human Behavior. I'm honoring those requests because it's vital that I do so. Because in order to truly emancipate our minds from white mental slavery, we must elevate our thinking above the fictional Willie Lynch slave syndrome myth and learn instead of Edward Bernays and the Tavistock Institute of Human Behavior. It is there where we need to place our focus in order to gain an accurate understanding of our plight and condition, the accurate understanding that is necessary in order to develop the proper counter strategies that are necessary and required to emancipate our minds from white mental slavery. Here are some facts that we must consider. 60 years ago, African Americans implemented the most successful unified protests in U.S. history. Today, African Americans are now more divided than in any previous time in U.S. history. 60 years ago, most African Americans unanimously agreed that white oppressive forces were our worst enemies. Today, millions are now insisting that it's ourselves that are now our worst enemies. 60 years ago, Black liberation was important to virtually all Black people. Today, most don't care about Black liberation. Most instead only wants a comfortable footing within the system of white supremacy. 60 years ago, we proudly wore afros and declared that Black is beautiful. Today, millions of us are wearing European wigs and bleaching our skins. 60 years ago, we called ourselves brothers and sisters, and we called our oppressors crackers. Today, we're calling ourselves niggers and bitches, and we're calling our oppressors white people. Clearly, we're now respecting ourselves lesser and respecting them more. Millions of Black people also now reveres Caucasians in spite of a brutally horrific history to the contrary. These noted profound changes within the Black community and our culture clearly benefits the white society. It's always by deliberate design whenever the oppressed starts thinking in ways benefiting the oppressors. Yes, our collective minds have in fact been deliberately manipulated to think in ways that are against our own interests and that instead serve the interests of the white society. It is true, but it has nothing to do with a silly slave syndrome myth. If our current condition was connected to something that was done to us during slavery, then our symptoms would logically lessen with each new generation as we move further away from the era of slavery, not worsen as we witnessed. The fact that our condition has worsened proved that it has nothing to do with what was done to us during slavery. The truth of our collective condition is directly connected to the Tavistock Institute of Human Behavior. The Tavistock Institute of Human Behavior is the largest mass manipulation organization in the world. It is the world's center for mass brainwashing and social engineering activities. It grew from its beginning at the Wellington House into a sophisticated organization that was to shape the destiny of the entire planet and in the process change the paradigm of modern society. With connections to the U.S. research institutes and think tanks, the Tavistock has a large reach. The Tavistock Institute of Human Behavior was established in 1946. Today, the organization is known as the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations. They made this change to their name because this name sounds less ominous. If you now visit its website, you'll see that it now describes itself as a British not-for-profit organization concerned with groups' behavior and organizational behavior. But the true history behind the Tavistock Institute is much more sinister. The following information can be found within my book entitled The Black People's Matrix. It's the largest chapter in the book. I will therefore do my best to condense it the best I can. Here's the sinister history of the Tavistock Institute. 1. 1946. 2. 1946. 3. 1946. 4. 1946. 5. 1946. 6. 1946. 7. 1946. 8. 1946. 9. 1946. 10. 1946. 11. 1946. 12. 1946. 13. 1946. 14. 1946. 15. 1946. 16. 1946. 17. 1946. 18. 1946. 1946. 1946. 1946. 1946. 1946. 1946. 1946. 1946. 1946. 1946. 1946. 1946. 1946. 1946. 1946. 1946. 1946. 1946. 1946. 1946. 1946. 1946. 1946. 1946. 1946. 1946. 1946. 1946. 1946. 1946. 1946. 1946. 1946. 1946. 1946. 1946. 1946. 1946. 1946. 1946. 1946. 1946. 1946. 1946. 1946. 1946. 1946. 1946. 1946. 1946. 1946. 1946. 1946. 1946. 1946. 1946. 1946. 1946. 1946. About 80 years ago, a group of very affluent ruling white elites comprising of members including the J.P. Morgan dynasty, the Rockefeller dynasty, the Rothschilds from Europe, the Warburgs from Germany, etc., etc. They set into motion a plan to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. In short, they seek total quiet control over the entire world, basically using Great Britain as a nucleus of a system, which also would be joined with the U.S. under the Anglo-American establishment. This group of white elites wrote about changes of culture over 100 years period that they would actually design, implement, and bring into reality. These writings contained plans of obtaining world dominance. It outlined that in order to meet the objective that the white elites, the ruling elites, would have to find a way to control the collective conscience of the masses. If their desired result of the ruling elites is to control the masses, it followed that they would have to find a way wherein which the masses could be manipulated to accept and support the objectives of the ruling elites. This therefore required taking control of the mainstream media, because those who controls the mainstream media control the brainstem of a nation's collective consciousness. The definition of values by which people operate are greatly influenced by the mainstream media. Social norms promoted by the media can influence the way of thinking and the cognitive map of a populated audience. Because perceptions created by the media leads to non-deliberate thoughtful decision making or decisions below the level of consciousness. It has also been called thinking without actually thinking, and it ultimately leads to unconscious similar behaviors. People are like computers. All you have to do is keep giving them certain information every so often, and you can persuade an entire generation towards an implied objective through media subliminal programming. It doesn't matter if the information is true or not. Most will agree because they too have all been given the same information or disinformation. The ruling elites therefore determined which newspaper companies were the most influential. And an agreement was reached. The policy of the newspapers was brought, and an editor was placed at each paper to ensure that all published information was in keeping with the social engineering objectives of the ruling elites. As time progressed forward, they acquired control over radio, television, mass media outlets that we now have today. This created the media social engineering tactics that are still being presently used today for steering society. Now, a main architect of these mass manipulation programs was Edward Bernays. Bernays is regarded as the father of mass manipulation warfare. The Tavistock Institute praises Bernays as being its greatest prophet. Bernays was the first mass manipulation expert to use his uncle Sigmund Freud's study of the human mind to develop tactics for controlling the minds of the masses and targeted population. It was also Bernays that first permanently impressed upon the ruling elites the potential of large-scale propaganda to control public opinion. Bernays was also a direct advisor to several U.S. presidents, from Woodrow Wilson to Eisenhower. Bernays wrote in his 1928 book, Propaganda, that if we understand the mechanism and motive of a group mind, it is now possible to control and regiment the masses and targeted populations according to our will without them even knowing it. Bernays further stated that the human mind is like a computer. No matter how efficient it may be, its reliability is only as great as the information fed into it. If it's possible to control the input into the human mind, then no matter how intelligent people may be, it's entirely possible to control what they'll believe and how they'll think. Therefore, he said, those who controls the mainstream media controls the brainstem of a nation. This is the reality. Through repetitive media subliminal programming, an entire generation can be steered towards an implied objective. This was proven true when many researchers have said that it was a stunt function by the Rockefeller. When on October 30th, 1938, Orson Welles aired a fake radio show on CBS made to appear as real entitled War of the World. It was written by H.G. Wells. Upon hearing the radio broadcasts about an invasion, the public, believing that what they were hearing was true, responded with panic and violence. Acts of crimes were carried out against each other, against businesses, public looting, people fighting in the streets. The false radio show turned people against themselves. There are many that says that the airing was an experiment funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. What is known to be fact, however, is that after the program aired, the Rockefeller Foundation and CBS heads then funded studies at Princeton University on how mass media manipulation can be used as a weapon against large populations. It can in fact be used as a weapon of mass destruction. The highly funded research that followed in its aftermath directly led to media subliminal programming that are currently being used today for steering our society. Now, during the 1960s unprecedented unified black protests, it was determined that the U.S. Negro problem was precisely the type of issue that the Tavistock Institute was created to address. They used it to address what was then called the U.S. Negro problem. The history and the reason. During the 1960s, African Americans' unified protest against the U.S. system of white supremacy was unprecedented. African Americans confronted it on all fronts. It was confronted through civil disobedience, boycott strategies, militant stands, civil disobedience tactics, and nonviolent protests. It was also confronted by African American lawyers successfully defending their cases within America's highest Supreme Court. The degree of organized resistance and unified protest demonstrated by African Americans against the U.S. system of white supremacy was in fact extraordinary. Those collective strategies resulted in the enactment of many civil rights laws that improved the lives of all minorities. Therefore, while all ethnic groups possess the ability to bring about real changes within the United States, only African Americans have produced such changes. African Americans' unified protest still remains unrivaled by any other group in U.S. history. African Americans, however, had unknowingly proven themselves as being the greatest threat against the U.S. system of white supremacy. In the face of the unprecedented unified black protest, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover said that the unification of the American Negro was the greatest threat against the nation. African Americans' unprecedented demand for equality have placed African Americans directly at odds with the white ruling class's commitment towards maintaining its nation's white dominance. This threat necessitated that something had to be done to impede the momentum of African Americans in our unrivaled pursuit for equality. A momentum that, if it were to succeed, would erode the white society's dominance. To remedy what was then called the Negro problem, in 1967, Lyndon Johnson put together a committee called the Kerner Commission. Their assignment was to study the Negro problem, find the cause of the problem, and then develop a solution to the problem. In 1968, white social scientists hired by the Kerner Commission determined that an aggravating core factor for that decade's unprecedented black protest was caused by an elevated and unifying black collective self-esteem brought on by the emergence of the Black Pride movement. They also learned that while oppressors, through their weaponry advantage of guns and cannons, can brutally invade and enslave a people, they, however, cannot win their loyalty or sustain peace with those people indefinitely unless their minds have been manipulated to think in ways that prevent them from unifying and seeking retribution against their oppressors. Because whenever people are oppressed for long durations, their collective aggressions toward their oppressors will continue to grow until it reaches a boiling point, until acts of rebellion happens. The oppressed always eventually rebels against their oppressors. This is an inherent response whenever people are held under long-term oppression. This is what was happening among the African American community during the 1960s. This was a core factor for the aggravating black revolt. White racism had reached a boiling point within the collective minds of African Americans, which resulted in that decade's unprecedented unified black protests. Those white social scientists logically determined that those same well-proven mass manipulation techniques developed by Edward Bernays for the Tavistock Institute could also be used for controlling black population and for subduing black protests. More specifically, they determined that they could subdue unified black protests by deploying an ideological subversion system that keeps the collective self-esteem of the black masses very low and keeps our collective aggression shifted away from the white society and redirected towards ourselves. Excuse me. This was easily achieved than most people think because the white society controls all black narratives. This unfair scenario allowed the white society to easily negatively shape how black people perceive ourselves. And people are easily controlled by the narrative that they receive about themselves. If people constantly are inundated with positive narratives about themselves, this raises their self-esteem and unifies them and inspires them. However, if people are constantly inundated with fraudulent negative narratives about themselves, the exact opposite happens. This creates self-hatred and disunity, which attacks the core foundation of what bonds them as a people, and they can be ruled over forever. This is precisely what is now being done to black people as a means of preventing us from now unifying ourselves against the white oppressive society. The white media's unrelenting negative depictions of black people that amplifies the negative to the point that it literally distorts our reality is much more than just biased media reporting. It is actually an insidious black racially demoralizing divide and rule psychological warfare campaign. Demoralized divide and rule is a method of maintaining control over a targeted population through constant and unrelenting demoralization in order to create self-hate and division between them. It's a well-documented and well-proven social science tactic used for controlling targeted population. It is a process with the objective to erode the morale of the targeted population through continuous demoralization. By destroying the morale of the targeted population, it can even prevent their will to fight. It is very effective because no group can be constantly inundated with negative, demoralizing disinformation about themselves and not suffer some adverse effect. It's not possible. Whenever people are heavily demoralized, this divides them, makes them self-loathing, and shifts their collective aggressions away from their enemies and redirects it towards themselves. This condition makes them much easier to control. This is the psychological warfare system that's being presently deployed against black people by white oppressive forces. White people are the authors of the narrative that black people believe about ourselves. This means that black people's identity is rooted in what white people tells us to believe about ourselves. Because they write our narratives, they give us an identity that we don't get to choose. And it's an identity they've given us. It's always a false one that marginalizes us, denigrates us, and puts us beneath them. This psychological warfare system is deployed like a massive media marketing campaign that constantly subjects black people to receiving only the fraudulent and worst narratives about ourselves. Within this system, fraudulent black racially demoralizing propaganda is pumped unrelentingly into the unsuspecting minds of the black population without being challenged or counterbalanced by an equal amount of black positive racially affirming information. It conveys a subliminal message that black people are now our own worst enemies and that we therefore need whites to govern over our lives. Moreover, that black people should admire, respect, and trust only whites. This system is extremely effective because when black people are repetitively presented these noted narratives from trusted white media sources, it can be very difficult to resist its implied propaganda programming, especially when the propaganda is being told daily and so unrelentingly. Its weapon is the demoralizing message that it carries and the way that it adversely affects the black population in terms of our behavior. The basis of this concept of warfare works by affecting the subconscious minds of black people through demoralizing propaganda. It works by tapping into the immense power that shame has upon the human mind to mentally enslave black people. With time being unable to refute the constant negative information about ourselves, many black people eventually comes to accept it and start resenting each other. The negative propaganda influence how we function. People function based on what they're made to believe. And the white society keeps us believing the worst about ourselves. This is how they shifted our collective aggressions away from the white society and redirected towards ourselves. This is why many black people insist that it's we who are our worst enemies. But the ultimate goal is to demoralize black people to such an extent that we begin to doubt our ability to govern ourselves. And we then believe that we therefore need white people to govern over our lives. Moreover, that we're better off living under white dominance, and therefore we abandon all hopes of ever liberating ourselves. It also creates, as I said, black self-hatred and disunity, which attacks the core foundation of what bonds us as a people, and we can then be ruled over forever. This is our reality. They prevent us from figuring out how the subjugation system works by keeping our minds distracted by silly slave syndrome myth, which presents what would in fact be the least plausible scenario for controlling millions of people down generational lines. It's simply not how brainwashing works. You know, some black people have been so heavily demoralized by the white society's fraudulent negative media depictions of us that many literally find it easier to continue believing the fraudulent worst about ourselves than to accept the true fact that we're being lied to about ourselves as a means of controlling us. If you doubt that this disclosure is true, that white oppressive forces are manipulating us, then it's because you're not critically thinking. Because it's in fact so clearly obvious that this is what's being done to us, that it's only by not critically thinking that it cannot be seen. For when critically thinking, it becomes clear to see just how cartoonishly unrealistic it actually is that virtually all information that we receive about ourselves from the white society are consistently negative and black racially demoralizing. It's cartoonishly unrealistic. It is an insidious black racially demoralizing divide and rule psychological warfare campaign. The general population doesn't know what's happening, and it doesn't even know it doesn't know. Noam Chomsky said that. Noam Chomsky is a renowned activist, and he's been speaking on this subject for decades. He said that given the legacy of black enslavement and subjugation by the white society, that there's a fear that the black victims might rise up and take revenge against the white society. He said that the white society is deeply imbued with fear that Africans throughout the diaspora will someday repay the violence and oppression that has marred our history from them. This immense fear resulted in the white society deploying psychological warfare campaigns that manipulates black people in ways that prevent black unified retribution against the white society. Not all wars are fought on the battlefield. Most are fought in the mind. Through the skillful, sustained use of repetitive media propaganda, white oppressive forces have created a prison for the minds of black people. And those black people who don't critically think never notices their mental change. This is all possible because people are like computers. All you have to do is keep giving people certain information every so often, and you can steer an entire generation toward an implied objective. The white society has exploited its monopoly over information that black people receive to shape our minds in ways that are against our own interest and instead serve the interest of the white society. This is our reality. This is the truth that we have to wake up to. And we can't keep believing in biblical fairy tales and silly slave syndrome because our understanding stays flawed, and all of our remedies that stems from those flawed understandings will remain flawed. This is the truth. Brothers and sisters, it's time to wake up to the truth. One love and peace.